Hi, everyone. I'm Neal. I've been giving a few talks about Monzo recently to mixed audiences, and some people very familiar with Monzo, some less so. So I'll poll to begin with. Do you know what Monzo is? Yes? Amazing. So I'll focus on the other stuff then. So we have our hot coral card, and I was the lucky winner of the internal company raffle on whose name gets put on the tubats. And yeah, that's me. Makes it super easy to introduce myself at conferences now. And also surfaced some old friendships on Facebook. So yeah, Monzo is a bank. We're an app-only bank. And many of you raised your hands, so I hope these screenshots are familiar. And we're currently growing at a remarkable rate. I made these slides a few weeks ago, and I just took a screenshot of the counter that we have on our home screen, our home webpage, and that one's out of date now. And that counter, since we are here today, I have to say, is connected to Looker to update on a regular basis. So I'm in the data team, as is Dimitri, our head of data. Give us a wave. Yep. And now he's hiding. And when I joined the data team, there were, well, when I interviewed for the data team, it was just Dimitri and one other person. When I joined, there were 5, and now, fast forward about a year, there are about 20 of us. And that's compared to several hundred across the whole company. So this brings us to how we operate as a team. There are so few of us that a lot of our focus is around enabling the rest of Monzo to make great decisions quickly using the data that we have. So we enable better decisions faster is our mission. So how do we work towards this? These are the 3 things I'll be talking about today. So the team, foundations, how we structure the team, the infrastructure that we use, how we try and go beyond the traditional concepts of BI and receiving questions and then having to serve answers. And finally, how we're sort of trying to balance between what are the bits of Monzo and data that we educate people in order to enable them versus what are the bits that we automate so that people don't even have to think about at all. And clearly, Looker is a big part of this picture. And roughly speaking, about 70% of our Looker accounts are now active on a weekly basis. So this is one of the metrics that we use to measure our own success. And yeah, I think that number is probably higher than the Monzo app. So a lot of good data insights being done in all sorts of corners of Monzo without us probably even knowing about them. So I'll dive right in, start with the data team itself. As I said, there are about 20 of us. And broadly speaking, we're split into 3 kind of big chunks. Product analytics, domain analytics, so that covers operations, financial crime, lending, and finally, the team that I'm working with and leading is machine learning. So the biggest question that you hear at all sorts of data science conferences is what's the best way to structure a data team inside of a company? And there's always this to and fro between the distributed model, which is you put a data scientist or a data analyst where they are needed in the business, versus a centralized model, which is you bring all your analysts and data scientists into a single team to work together. So clearly the reason there's always this trade-off is because there's some benefits of having either. So if you have a centralized team, you have all your peers nearby. You can help each other to grow and to become better at data and data analysis and machine learning. You can develop common tools. You don't have to reinvent the wheel each time. But the key drawback is you can become very distant from the rest of the company. And by distant, that means you lose the context of the problems you're trying to solve. So you go to the other end of the spectrum, and you put a data scientist into the team where they're needed. And oftentimes, that'll be great. They'll be right on the front line, solving critical problems, giving data where it's needed, when it's needed. They can work directly to enable the product managers and engineers who literally sit beside them. But like I said, we're a small team. We can't be everywhere. And also in sort of past lives, different companies, you often reach the stage where in a distributed team, people start feeling a little bit lonely. So right now, we try and balance between the two. And this is something that is always going to be a moving target. I imagine if I stand up here in 5 years' time and give a talk, then this slide will be very different. But we do some things together as a team. So peer review, asking each other the difficult analytics questions, knowledge sharing, career development. So all of the folks like myself and Dimitri who we manage other data scientists. And we run all of our infrastructure together as a data team. However, all of our analysts in particular are also embedded into a product team, into one or maybe even two at a time. So that's where they'll pick up their daily tasks. They'll go to stand-up. They will do retros with those teams. And that's where they'll prioritize what the next bit of work that they need to do is. So even though I'll be managing people, I manage, for example, an analyst who works in operations. I don't set his weekly work. I just make sure that his career is on track. So I mentioned there's these two things that underpin the team. The first one is our culture, and the second one is our infrastructure. And a few weeks back, we took the whole team offsite, and we talked about this first bit of what are the values that underpin our team, and what does that mean in terms of how we work on a day-to-day basis. And this is what came out of that session, and maybe the podium is hiding some of it. But yeah, the main takeaway is that since there are so few of us, then each individual data analyst at Monzo needs to be very impactful, needs to have a high impact. So that translates into having this, we call it the mini CEO mindset. You have to own the area that you're working in, be an evangelist to encourage others to use data to make decisions. You need to have a collective growth mindset. So that means you're not just optimizing yourself or improving yourself, but you're helping all of data at Monzo to grow. And similarly, you should be a force multiplier in terms of doing work that can then enable tens of people to do that work again. And I'll come to some examples there in the next few slides. And then finally, these last two, slowing down to speed up and technical mastery, are aspects that we think about in terms of what speed actually means in our core mission statement. So when we say making better decisions faster, we don't mean just get an answer every time a question is asked, but we mean understanding that question and enabling it so that that team can revisit that question every single day if needed as they continue on their journey without having to come back to us. So yeah, this is clearly the very abstract stuff, and turning it into reality is what our day-to-day looks like. But yeah, there's that other side, which is our actual tech stack. So this is a tweet from Oliver, who is, I think, the head of our engineering function. And he tweeted this in September of last year, where he was looking at the growth of the Monzo backend system. So the whole Monzo platform runs on AWS, and it is architected as a set of microservices. So if you're not familiar with this, effectively what it means is that all of our engineers can ship these small units, small components, small bricks that, when put together, make the building. And all of these are logging a load of data. And you can imagine that anytime a customer clicks a button, opens a new type of account, closes their account, gets an overdraft, anything, data gets logged. And all of this data will find its way to BigQuery. And there's this whole article that I stumbled upon online when I was looking for some graphic to show on this slide, which is actually an interview with Dimitri about how we use BigQuery to run our analytics. And then Looker is the final bit of our whole analytics stack. But in particular, all of our data ends up in BigQuery. It has been sanitized, so stripped of anything that's personally identifiable. So it really makes it safe to use for anyone on the data team. And so on your first day, if you were joining the Monzo data team today, you would receive your laptop. You would set up your GitHub credentials. And what you would find is this repository that we call analytics, which is one repository that has everything for our analytics. And so very similar to the concept that I explained for our backend architecture, where you have all the bricks that together make the building. All of our analytics lives in this analytics repo as these different units that are then managed using Airflow. And so we'll run different queries on a nightly basis. That's the bulk of them. And then particularly for customer support, which has some more pressing data needs, we'll run some of these queries actually on a near real-time basis, as we call it, so multiple times an hour. So yeah, this brings us to one of the key bits of like, OK, we're putting all of our code in one place. That's great. But what is the actual code that we write? And one of the key differences in my experience of joining Monzo was this one of switching mindsets from writing queries to answer a question that you've received and moving towards writing queries to create data models that enable answering many, many different types of questions. So it's a slight shift in workflow. But one of the key benefits of it is that now it acts as a force multiplier, right? So I'm going to try and link this back to our values. But effectively, we're trying to put our code together in a way that every time an analyst does one piece of work, the next analyst won't have to do it again. So let's look at that with a very practical example. 90+% of the questions that we get in data at Monzo is something about how has something changed recently. How many new customers do we have this week compared to last week, compared to last month? How many customers got in touch with customer support today, this week, last month, split by whatever. And you can imagine a classical BI setup where these questions are received, and we do a piece of work, and we send the answer back. And clearly, what that leads to is that the BI team becomes the bottleneck for answers. And so the way that we've worked around this is that every time a new question comes up, which is about how are things changing over time, the analyst doesn't start from raw data to compute an answer. What they do is they add a new column into one of our, we call them a canonical data models, which is called user stats. And user stats is one row per customer per day that they've been with Monzo. And it's a very, very wide table in BigQuery because it has columns on like how many transactions they had that day, how many conversations do they have, whether they enabled certain features, whether they disabled them, all sorts. And this is a very good example of switching that mindset. Because now, if someone comes along to me and says, hey, Neal, we've released, what have we released? We released ISAs. So I'm sure someone is already doing this work. How many customers have enabled an ISA in their account? Then instead of going and finding the ISA data and writing a select and group by and count, the task is instead to add ISA enablement into user stats. And not only does that allow everyone to then access that data, but it allows them to compare it to anything else that has been added to user stats in the past, which includes stuff like how many customers got in touch with customer support. So this is something that I've only seen at Monzo so far. And it's a pattern that is really powerful because it does act as this force multiplier that every time a new how much has X changed over time question appears, you put it into user stats, it's just a couple lines to add, and then not only do you get the answer to your original question, but you get the answer to your original question compared to all of the previous questions that have been asked in the past. So, like I said, this ends up in Looker, and there's a small snippet from our weekly KPI dashboard that gets sent out to the whole company. But one of the most recent things is we've started sort of aggressively organizing Looker to make it as accessible as possible. So that's why here you see pending. It's not a finished thing, but it's a way that we've been working towards capturing the uniformity that we have in our data models at a team level. So that now, as Monzo grows, you don't need to know all of the ins and outs of how we grow and the growth teams. You just need to go to the dashboard finder and click on growth, and you'll see all their key metrics. So that's kind of the broad setup that we have. The last two bits that I have are now starting to be about things that are different from the usual usage of Looker. And that's kind of what I wanted to highlight here today, to maybe give you some ideas. Maybe you have some ideas that you can share with us. But really, again, just to loop it back, it captures our broad concept of enabling others to work with data. So again, as I've said before, the classical thing we're trying to avoid is being responsive to the business, waiting for someone to come to us with a question in order to do something for them. So one of the things that happens at Monzo on a daily level, multiple times a day, is some sort of product experiment will be launched. These cover a variety of things, making the sign-up flow easier, making loans more discoverable, making the help screen better so that fewer customers have to get in touch with us. You name it, there's part of the Monzo app, there's probably an experiment that's being run there right now. And so clearly, did my experiment go well is a question that the data team will get every day. Or how is my experiment going? And so there's two things that I want to highlight. One of them is not the Looker side, which is we use Notion for a lot of our documentation, and we've set up a table there called Monzo Experiments, where whenever someone is starting a new product experiment, they go and they add an entry to this table, and it says what the name of the experiment is, what their hypothesis is, what part of the app it's affecting, and they can add any other details. And critically, they'll also add a link to a Looker dashboard, which shows how their experiment went. And naturally, making that dashboard every time a new experiment happens is something that goes way beyond a team of 20 to cater for. So one of our analysts, or a few of them, ooh, my clicker's not working. There we go, has set up a way to automate this process. So to do that, and while I was making these slides, I just went into our Monzo Experiments table, and I found a recent one from February. And so Ed is one of our, he's listed as the experiment owner here. And he was looking at referrals. So in Monzo, you can, if you want to give your friend a Monzo account, you used to be able to send them a golden ticket, and now you can send them a referral where if they open an account after receiving your referral, you'll both get a little bit of money. So it's like they've experimented with loads of different schemes. I think the main one right now might be give 5, get £5. But this is a huge area for experimentation. Which way works? And so he's written a document about this. He says he thinks that by sending customers a notification, they're more likely to share these referrals. He wants to measure the % of users who are sharing referrals after receiving that notification. And he launched this experiment in February. And so all he then had to do with our support is go into a Looker dashboard that has been pre-built for him, pre-built for all of Monzo, and add in his experiment ID as one of the filters. And by adding that in, he gets all of the default metrics pre-populated for his experiment. The very simple things like how many users are in this experiment, have we reached the right thresholds there, so on. Just tracking that the experiment is going well, mostly. And then the second half is how did the experiment actually do? So this is something that the product analysts, and I think in particular Annabelle, built. And it's a fantastic tool because it is this sort of force multiplier that then a new product team launching an experiment just needs to go here and add their experiment ID. And they really only need to talk to us if they need something special, some metric that doesn't exist there. And closer to home, there are some times where we want to make product teams aware of certain metrics that may not be on their radar. So for example, a team may be experimenting with referrals, but their referral change may be causing many customers to get in touch with customer support. So all we did was we updated this self-service dashboard to add those metrics in there. So then any new team coming in, putting their experiment ID there, would get the how much are you causing load on the customer support team metrics by default. So that's one of the biggest tools now for enabling product experimentation. But there are two other small ones that have an equal possibility of letting people do stuff with Looker and data and not having to even come and talk to us. Right? So this was animated, but it doesn't seem to be working. So yeah, I can share my slides later on. But effectively, another very similar question is, hey, I've released this new feature. It's logging this data. Like, are we seeing the data? Is it coming in? And so we have a little animation where if it were working effectively, what it would show you is adding in the name of the new event that you've started logging, and then you click run, and it just shows how much data are we receiving right away. And so this is a force multiplier for engineers who often care about that question. Are you receiving all the data? Am I logging it properly? Is it the way I expect it to be? And finally, again, I apologize, the animation isn't quite working. The last most recurrent question that we were getting was, what about this funnel? So when users click here, do they then click here? Do they then click here? And so on. And so we built it again as a self-service mechanism where they can pick multiple events, say clicking on a transaction screen, then clicking on this merchant logo is incorrect, and then clicking on submitting a suggestion for fixing a merchant logo. And by just putting those 3 event names in, they can click run, and they get the funnel. And again, they don't have to come and talk to us. So these examples capture a really sort of powerful abstraction, which is less about using Looker for all the cool basic stuff, dashboards and graphs, and more thinking around how can we capture the recurrent questions, the questions that happen all the time, and then tune Looker in order to allow people to answer those questions without coming to us. So for my last bit, this is the final consideration is clearly, and I'm sure many of you appreciate this, introducing new tools into the company, into any company, requires a lot of education. And Looker is no exception. And way back in the day, long before I even knew of Monzo, I think our head of data, Dimitri, was running weekly sessions with the whole company. Weekly Looker University data at Monzo sort of sessions. And that's fantastic, but it's clearly something that you can do only if the whole company fits in one room. If the whole company can take 30 minutes out of their day to do that. And so we've grown way beyond our ability for that to happen. So our education now is a little bit different, and specifically, it's a little bit tailored. So here's just 2 Slack messages of when we were announcing new training. So Alicia from the data team was running an introduction to Looker session, and at one stage, I think she was running them monthly for the whole company. And these were the, I've joined Monzo and I've never heard of this thing called Looker, but people keep telling me I need to use it type of sessions, right? So covering 2 broad areas. The first being the human introduction to Looker. What is a dimension? What is a measure? What is an explore? A view? And all of these sort of things. And then the second aspect, after this 101 training, moving on to what is the specific way that we use Looker at Monzo. So things like what are our core data sets, like user stats, and what does it mean? What does user stats mean? And learning that it means 1 row per customer per day. For a while, obviously, we have to add some data behind this as well. I think there were probably, in this case, 20 attendees for that one session, but on a month-on-month basis, it'd be between 20 and 30 people. And then on the other end of the spectrum is a session that I was running for a little while, which we call Looker for Devs. And so this was for anyone who can write a little bit of SQL and who understands the event architecture, the event logs that we have, and wants to be empowered to be able to add something into our analytics, get it to run once a day, and surface it in Looker. So we would go through, in that session, a toy example where we want to understand, for customers who claim that they have a problem or misunderstanding with one of their transactions, how are they going about telling us that in the app? Because you could do it from your feed, you could go to the help screen, and so a very simple sort of analytics question. But by attending this course, they would see the whole end-to-end process of find the name of the event, add it into analytics, make sure that it runs once a day, and then finally connect it up with Looker. So the key insight that we've had here is that as we've grown, training has to grow alongside it. And in particular, over time, the observation is that training becomes more tailored and tailored to the audience. So there's separate training that is being run for our customer support, because they don't really need to manipulate data per se. They need to just understand it and understand their team dashboards. and then all the way to separate training for the lending team or the finance team. So this is clearly something that's, again, it's a bit of a moving target, but something that we're trying to keep up with and trying to sort of reinvent every so often. But one thing that we are excluding from this is other types of problems that instead we tackle by automation. So this screenshot from Looker, you may recognize it. All that's happened here is we updated something in BigQuery, maybe removed a column, maybe changed the name of a table, something happened. And suddenly our LookML and BigQuery is out of sync, so a dashboard broke. And this is something that we would get regular questions about. Or it could even be in other cases that a chart is showing no data, and it's because the chart is set with the wrong filters or something like that. And so this pattern would come up of people coming to our data request Slack channel and saying, hey, my dashboard's broken. What happened? And oftentimes, it would take a little bit of investigative work to see, oh, this column has been renamed. I've updated the LookML. Please refresh, and then it's all working. So how can we become better at this? Dimitri took it upon himself as a project last Christmas, last December. And instead of trying to detect that, or keep our BigQuery columns in line with our LookML definitions and sort of tackle the problem that way, we said, wait, it's really easy for someone to look at a chart and recognize that it's broken. Why don't we use a machine learning algorithm to do the same thing? So if you don't have a background in machine learning, one of the things that has really taken leaps and bounds forward in the last couple of years is image classification. And that has mostly been driven by these public competitions where researchers from around the world develop neural networks to try and predict up to 1,000 different categories from any image. And those 1,000 categories include things like cats and dogs and boats and cars and all sorts of things. Clearly, we don't need to recognize any of those. We need to recognize whether a Looker chart is broken or not. So there's an approach that has been applied in a variety of domains called fine-tuning, where you effectively chop off the last bit of a neural network, which is the bit that's trying to figure out if it's a cat or a dog or a mouse or a boat. But you keep the rest of the neural network, which is the bit that has figured out how to look at an image. And then you just train that last bit on a new question. And that new question is this Looker chart broken? And the answer is yes or no. And so there's a little bit of a manual phase here where you use the Looker API and you download a whole bunch of images and you set some as broken and you set some as not broken. And then the rest gets taken care of by this neural network. So the nice thing about this, apart from being about neural networks, is that it's a very good example of using a fairly mature-ish machine learning approach to tackle something that was a big nuisance for us. And now, instead, when this neural network does its thing on all of our Looker charts, it tells us all of these ones are the broken ones. So we can proactively go and fix things. We can recognize where there are patterns in things that are breaking. And just to show where we are with this today, we've recently hired 2 people into a brand new role at Monzo, which we call analytics engineer. And these are people who are going to be tasked with the job of building things like this, or building tools that make an analyst's life easier. So this is another thing that I've seen at Monzo, and it's actually something that we've copied from engineers. The engineers have a team called the Engineering Effectiveness Squad, who whose job is just to build tools to make engineers faster. And so we've adopted some of their principles, and now we're going to have at least 2 people in the near future who are working on making tools to make analysts' lives faster and easier. So cool. I'll just like to wrap up. So our mission it remains to enable better decisions faster. And so that mission, actually, the core discussion that we had at our offsite was, how do we bring it to life? How do we actually make it happen? And so we structure our team and our tooling around these principles of, like, does it help us go faster? Does it help us enable others? And so you'll see these appear as little small examples throughout our daily life at Monzo. Looker, clearly an incredibly powerful tool to get the best out of our data, and we use it across all corners of Monzo, from company-level KPIs, and our CEO uses Looker, all the way down to running one-off product experiments. But the key takeaway for me, after a year of being in this environment, is about constantly keeping an eye out for how we can improve ourselves, our tooling, and help to enable others. So with that, thank you very much, and happy to take any questions.